One of the most fascinating things about growing up alongside the medium of video games itself is that I've gotten to experience the way in which the concepts that define gaming have evolved with time. I witnessed as conventions changed and adapted to the various trends that swept the growing industry at one point or another, for better or for worse, and I witnessed as ideas grew old and stale before finally dying and giving rise to new, fresh ways to design and to conceive of games. The scoring systems of arcade games gave way to the concept of lives as gaming moved into home consoles, for example, and then this very concept of lives eventually became obsolete as well. Or, here's another example that I find interesting. As I was doing research for my video on Doom 2016, I learned that reviewers and audiences alike seemed to praise the way in which the game used green lights baked into the environment of the levels themselves as a way to highlight the critical path that players should take, a subtle yet elegant and unobtrusive way to mark the levels to prevent players from getting lost. Fast forward a few years into the future, however, and the discourse taking place about yellow paint in games has shifted entirely. Like I said, conventions change, evolve, adapt, continue to build upon each other, or they die and are forgotten only to be revived later on as the pendulum swings back around. And yet sometimes none of this happens. Sometimes a convention simply stagnates. It becomes a thing that keeps being repeated by mere inertia over and over. And I think that the concept of collectibles in games is one such convention. Having collectibles in games has become a thing in and of itself. It seems to me that developers continue to put collectibles into games for no other reason than because it's expected of them. And, on the other hand, audiences continue to expect collectibles in games for no other reason than because the more content a game has, the better it must be. Because of this, it feels like every modern game that comes out must inevitably have some form of collectible that adds nothing to the gameplay experience or the narrative of the game, even when it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever for that game to have collectibles at all in the first place. Which is not to say that collectibles can't offer some kind of value to a gaming experience. I think that, traditionally, the role of collectibles has been to give the player a reason to engage with the world of a game in new and different ways. One of the most fascinating things about games as a medium is that players get to interact actively with the experience as a whole, and having collectibles is just one way in which developers can push players to go off the beaten path. I experienced this very thing recently while playing Monster Hunter Rise. The level design in Monster Hunter games has always been praised for being top-notch, and Monster Hunter Rise is no different. The environments in Rise are rich with all kinds of items that you can collect, some of which provide gameplay advantages and some of which don't. The levels are packed with flora, fauna, and other resources to gather during hunts, all of it to give players the feeling that they are exploring a complex living ecosystem. Not only that, but the topography of the levels themselves is full of secret pathways and alcoves, tunnels and caverns, ruined castles and forgotten shrines, none of which you would normally encounter if you focused solely on the core gameplay loop of fighting monsters in the same open arenas that are scattered throughout each level. Rise also has a set of relics, old messages that contain bits of lore about the history of the many environments of the game. Searching for these collectibles provides no advantage while hunting a monster, but it gives the player a reason to go off and delve into the rich world around them. In the footage that I'm showing right now, you can see that as I was freely exploring the mountains at the center of the shrine ruins, I happened to climb to the top of a peak just in time to see the sun setting behind the horizon. These are the kinds of details that you'd miss if all you did was engage with the core gameplay loop of fighting monsters over and over. The same kinds of details that help make the worlds of Monster Hunter games feel so alive. More recently, collectibles have also been used in creative ways by developers to expand upon the narrative elements of a game, and I think that a good example of this can be found in The Last of Us Part 2. As you make your way through the levels of The Last of Us Part 2, you'll gather all kinds of resources that'll help you overcome the many challenges of the game, from bricks that you can use to distract enemies to bottles of pills that allow you to unlock new abilities for your character, not to mention all of the weapons, bullets, healing items, and crafting components that you'll need to survive the many combat encounters in the game. At the same time, you'll also come across many notes scattered around the world which serve as lore entries that help flesh out the game's sense of world building. In addition to these two kinds of items, however, you'll also encounter a third one, the game's only true collectible, a set of items that doesn't provide any kind of gameplay effect or advantage, nor does it seem to add anything to the game's overall lore or story either, at least on first glance. Each of the two playable characters in The Last of Us Part 2 have their own set of collectibles, coins for Abby, and a collection of trading cards that depict characters from a fictional brand of comics for Ellie. Now, the thing that is immediately interesting about these collectibles is that all of these items are actual things that people collect in real life. Coins, comics, and trading cards, which creates an interesting connection between the post-apocalyptic world of the game and our own present lives. But more interestingly to me is the fact that within the context of the game's narrative, these collectibles are used as literary devices that serve to expand upon the personalities and motivations of the game's two playable protagonists, as well as the game's central themes in general, in a subtle but very compelling way. For example, it seems like a very fitting thing to have Abby's collectibles be coins. Coins embody the concept of currency, which is narratively appropriate since Abby's character is mainly driven by a desire for revenge. The whole story of the game takes place to begin with because Abby travels a vast distance looking for Joel just so that she can settle an unpaid debt. Abby's main motivation is to collect what is due to her. Later in the game, when Abby first meets Yara and Lev, her attachment to these new characters seems to be born at first from a transactional sense as well. Yara and Lev save Abby, and so she must pay that due back by saving them too. In addition to this, we also learn that Abby feels guilty about Joel's death. When asked by Lev why she'd go so far to help them, Abby says that she needed to do it to lighten up her guilt a bit. In other words, Abby's whole worldview is transactional. She must, in one way or another, collect or pay a debt to someone else, a binary that is mirrored by the greater conflict between the wolves and the Seraphites. And yet, by the end of the story, Abby slowly grows out of this narrow perspective as she begins to see Yara and Lev as family. Now, just as is the case with Abby, Ellie's collectibles teach us a bit about who she is as a character too. Ellie's collectibles are a set of trading cards from a fictional comic book series, a callback to the first Last of Us game, in which we see Joel collect comic book issues that he saves for Ellie. Now, traditionally, comic books used to be associated with children because, like video games, they were often seen more as toys than actual literature. Thankfully, both comics and video games are beginning to be appreciated as works of creative art. And yet, within the context of The Last of Us specifically, comic books do have a connection to the themes of childhood and innocence, the reason being that, during the first game, comic books are associated with a younger version of Ellie. Having grown up in the violent world of The Last of Us, I wouldn't say that Ellie was strictly innocent, even as a child. Still, when Joel dies at the beginning of Part 2, any last shred of innocence that Ellie might have had dies along with him. Thus, as we play through the game and we collect the various trading cards lying about, it almost feels as though Ellie is trying to hold on to that last shred of innocence, to hold on to the memories that she has of being a child with Joel, of the life that they could have had but never did. The image of the trading cards, and that of comic books in general, also brings to mind the concept of heroes, which is interesting when you consider that Ellie's story in The Last of Us Part 2 works almost like a twisted, perverted version of the hero's journey. And if you actually look at the cards themselves, you'll also notice that each character is assigned a moral alignment. In the back of each card, you'll see a spectrum that goes from hero to villain, with each character falling somewhere along this moral scale. This simplistic and binary way to cleanly divide people into heroes or villains informs the game's central narrative. Not only is the game built around a series of binary conflicts between opposing groups of people, but the story also constantly pushes us to question our allegiance to the central characters, with Ellie's actions slowly separating her from the player's side even as Abby grows more and more into a sympathetic character. Thus, I'd argue that collectibles in The Last of Us Part 2 actually help expand upon the personality of the central characters and the main themes of the story as a whole in a compelling, if very subtle way. And so, despite the fact that collectibles, in a larger sense, have become a stagnant convention in modern gaming that developers keep putting into their games for no other reason than because it's expected of them and because they need to add more content, every now and then I'll come across a game that uses the very concept of collectibles in creative and surprising ways, as the aforementioned examples have hopefully demonstrated. And yet, of all of the games that I've played in recent years, the one that has stayed with me the most when thinking about the topic of collectibles in games has to be a small indie game called The First Tree. The First Tree is about a man who wakes up in the middle of the night from a dream in which he inhabits the body of a fox searching for her lost cubs. What's really interesting about the story of this game, and also the main hook of the game in general, is that the player takes on the role not of the human speaker, but of this dream fox mother. In other words, we play through the speaker's dream. As we progress through the game, the story unfolds in a series of audio narration snippets as the speaker recounts the dream to his partner. Through this conversation, the speaker and his partner use the dream to leap into other subjects, such as their family histories and past regrets, and we learn that the speaker's father has passed away recently, an event that has left the speaker shaken and which is also probably the source of his weird dream in the first place. The gameplay is very simple. Taking control of the fox, we explore various beautifully crafted levels in search of the fox's lost cubs, while the voice-overs playing in the background give us a greater insight into the speaker/dreamer's life. There is no combat or puzzle solving, nothing but the act of moving through the levels itself. Like many other games in which the main focus of the experience is to simply explore a series of levels, we can go out of our way to search for secrets and hunt for collectible stars that are scattered throughout the areas, much in the style of coins in a Mario game. As you play through the game, you don't really get the sense that these collectible stars mean anything at all. They appear to be just the same kind of generic, meaningless collectible that you see in many other games, like they're there just to be collected. But there is a twist at the end of the game that involves these stars, and it creates a moment that, in my opinion, elevates the narrative and turns it into something greater in a way that simply could just not happen in any other medium of storytelling. The central theme of The First Tree is that of loss. The game conflates its two sides into a single experience. On one hand, we hear as the speaker/dreamer recounts his relationship with his father when he was alive, even as he reckons with his feelings of regret and mourning after his death. And, on the other hand, we embody the dream fox as she searches for her lost cubs, and we experience her loss when, near the end of the dream, we learn that our and the fox's efforts have been in vain, as we find that all of the fox's cubs are already dead. The fox, devastated by this loss, makes her way to the first tree, which allows her to leave a final message for her lost cubs. At this point in the game, a box pops up on screen with a text that reads, quote, "The first tree awakens and gently asks if there is one last message the fox wants to tell her children. She replies back and says," end quote. And just below this, we get a dialog box in which the player themselves can type the fox's last message to her cubs. Since this game has an online element to it, whatever the player types in this box will appear within the world of other players as they play through the game. But there is a catch. The number of characters available for the player to type the message in this box is equal to the number of stars that they collected throughout their playthrough. This is a very simple twist, but I love what it does to the narrative. Having things to collect in games is one of the oldest, most ingrained conventions in the whole medium. There are entire games, entire franchises that are specifically built upon the idea of gathering collectibles. But collectibles are present in all kinds of games, from puzzle games to first-person shooters, third-person action games, survival horror, RPG and strategy games, and even story-oriented games. As I said before, including collectibles in games is just a thing that developers do now. But I love the way in which the first tree employs this convention and uses it to reinforce the overall narrative of the game. In the first three, the stars that you collect throughout the game literally become the language with which the fox mother can say goodbye to her cubs. In other words, if the player explored the areas of the game thoroughly, then they will be able to leave a larger message at the end of the game. But if the player simply rushed through the whole thing, then their final message will be more limited. And this is important because I think that this little twist at the end of the game resonates with the story's themes: loss, regret, and the process of mourning. As the dreamer speaks about his father throughout the game, he thinks about his past regrets. He talks about how he wishes he would have done some things in a different way. He regrets how he treated his father on some specific occasions and laments that they were never really close. He regrets that the relationship wasn't as full as it could have been, that they didn't know each other as well as he now wishes they had. He regrets never having the language to express what he now wishes he could say to his father. And yet, at the same time, he also unearths memories of his father and realizes that their relationship was richer than he had originally thought at the beginning of the game, even as he yearns for connection and wishes that he had more time with him to say all the words that were left unsaid between them. In other words, as the speaker unearths memories of his father and attempts to say one last goodbye to him, the player controls the mother fox to explore the areas of the game, which ultimately allow the fox to leave a final message for her lost cubs. And the more time you take exploring the world, the more of it that you take in, the deeper you dig into the game's narrative, the larger the message that you can leave at the end will be. The message that I wrote in the dialogue box was a simple one. Counting the periods and the spaces, the total number of characters adds up to 27. That's 27 stars I needed to collect for such a short message. But I think the reason that this moment has stuck with me so much is that having to write this final message out of stars that I myself collected as I played throughout the game, and having to actually type that message on a keyboard made it feel really personal to me. In a way, it felt like I was inhabiting the character of the mother fox addressing her cubs, but at the same time, it also felt like I was leaving that final message for people that I've lost in my own life. By taking the concept of video game collectibles, something that is meaningless padding in most games, and transforming it into the actual words that the fox can use at the end of the game to express herself, the first three brilliantly subverts gaming conventions in a way that elevates the overall narrative of the game and manages to say something about the stories that are left untold between us and our loved ones, and the importance of finding the language to tell those stories before it's too late.